thought it was just another beach town in New Jersey, but something massive floated in its waters. Something built in silence and moved like a ghost across the Atlantic. No one spoke about it. No news, no headlines. Only whispers of a weapon that wasn't a bomb, but could carry an entire army. Why did thousands work on it without knowing what they were building? And how did it vanish after helping win the biggest war in history? Because what floated off New Jersey's coast wasn't just steel and screws. It was a secret, moving fortress, and its mission was never supposed to be known. Welcome to a brand new story from HISTORIA UNSEEN. My name is John. I'm the voiceover artist for this channel, and today we uncover the untold truth behind New Jersey's floating megafortress of World War II. What if I told you there was a floating city built in America that helped win World War II, but no one was ever supposed to know about it? It was born in silence, built by hands that never knew what they were building, and when it moved, it carried the power of 1,000 war machines. No headlines covered it, no awards were given, but its steel touched the shores of once-held Europe. This wasn't a weapon in the sky. It was a drop from a plane. It floated, like a ghost, from the coast of New Jersey. What happened next was buried for decades. The year was 1941. America had just entered World War II. The country was burning with energy, anger, and something more powerful than both, purpose. In the quiet towns of New Jersey, life felt normal. Factories buzzed. Men worked. Women rolled up their sleeves and joined them. No one knew yet that their state was about to become a weapon itself. But the higher minds, the leaders in Washington and London, they had a problem. The Allies needed a way to land tanks, trucks, and weapons on enemy beaches. But there were no ports. And building ports in enemy territory, impossible. Then someone said it. A strange, crazy idea. What if we built a port that floats? At first, people laughed. But the idea wouldn't die. Because deep down, the war was changing. And old ways weren't enough. New Jersey was picked. Not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. It had the space. It had the workers. And it had something else. Secrecy. Thousands were hired. Engineers, welders, builders. They were told they were helping the war effort, but not what they were building. Day and night, metal rang in the air. Gigantic steel boxes were welded together like puzzle pieces, each one bigger than a house. But no one saw the full picture. They weren't just building blocks. They were building pieces of a floating empire. To the people, it was just another factory job. But to a few, watching from locker rooms and guarded towers, this was the beginning of something dangerous and brilliant. Every piece built in New Jersey would later cross the Atlantic to become part of a secret project called Mulberry Harbor. It wasn't just steel and screws. It was a full port that could be dropped in the ocean and used like a real harbor. Ships could dock, tanks could roll, troops could land safely, and the enemy would never see it coming. But the men building it, they had no idea. One worker, many years later, said, "We thought we were making some kind of bridge parts. We didn't know they were going to France." The birth of this floating nation started in silence and stayed in silence. New Jersey became the war machine no one could understand at the time. It was just steel to some, but to others it was a vision, a weapon that didn't fire bullets, but carried the ones who did. By early 1944, the pieces were done. Massive blocks of steel, so big they were moved at night, so strange looking they had to be covered during transport. They were ready to move, and when they did, they moved like ghosts. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the sea, it remembered. The story of New Jersey's secret weapon had begun, but the world wouldn't know it for decades. And this was only the beginning. The steel had been built, the floating giants were ready, but where did this wild idea come from? How did someone even imagine a floating weapon? To understand that, we need to go back to the darkest days of the war. It was 1940. Europe was collapsing. Hitler's army was storming through France. Tanks rolled over cities. Bombs dropped from the sky like rain. Millions were fleeing, and Britain stood alone. The beaches of Europe were either in flames or under Nazi control, and there was one big problem the Allies couldn't solve. How do you land thousands of tanks and trucks if there are no ports left to land them on? Every port was destroyed or heavily defended. If the Allies wanted to take back Europe, they needed to bring in more than just soldiers. They needed supplies, heavy gear, artillery, food, fuel, and for that, they needed something no one had ever built before, something that didn't exist. That's when a strange idea reached Winston Churchill's desk. An idea so bold, so insane, that only war could make it possible. It said, let's build harbors that float. Churchill paused. He didn't laugh. He circled the note and wrote just one word. Yes. And from that single word, a new mission was born. They called it Mulberry, but it wasn't a fruit. It was a code name, and it would become one of the greatest military engineering feats in history. Across the Atlantic, American leaders saw the plan and nodded. They had factories, they had steel, they had people. New Jersey was chosen, quiet enough to hide secrets, and close enough to ship them out fast. Back in England, engineers began to sketch. They needed docks that could be broken into pieces, carried by sea, reassembled in the water, and strong enough to carry tanks. It sounded impossible. But war doesn't wait. There was no time to argue, only time to build. And across the sea, New Jersey began to move. Blueprints arrived in secret. Steel orders tripled overnight. Shipyards started building things they didn't understand. A piece here, a section there. No one saw the full puzzle, but someone did. A group of top engineers, hidden deep inside government offices, watched as the pieces came together. What they were building was not a ship, not a dock. It was a machine of war that didn't fire a single bullet, but would carry the bullets that mattered. By early 1943, the plan was alive. Factories worked day and night. Parts were tested in secret. Tugboats practiced pulling the massive steel blocks. If even one thing failed, the whole war plan could collapse, and no one could know. Everything depended on silence. The enemy couldn't find out. Even American soldiers weren't told the full truth. One general later said, "We didn't just need to land in France. We needed to bring our country with us." And that was the idea. Bring America's strength. Bring its machines. Bring its ports. Across the ocean. Not by ship, but by building the ocean itself. A floating harbor, born in New Jersey, that would land on the beaches of Normandy and change the war forever. The skies over New Jersey were quiet, but the ground was alive. Welders sparked through the night. Cranes moved steel as tall as houses, and docks groaned under the weight of something massive. But still, no one knew what they were really building. The project was too big, too strange, to make sense to anyone standing close. They were told, "You're building parts for the war," but they weren't told what parts, or where they were going, or why they were shaped like floating walls. The builders called them boxes, but each one was 200 feet long, weighing over 6,000 tons. To the eye, they looked like giant, hollow steel coffins, but they were much more than that. They were pieces of a floating harbor. One by one, they were being built across shipyards, beaches, factories in New Jersey. And then, something even stranger began. The testing started. At night, away from cameras, away from the public. These massive blocks were floated into the water, tugged by tiny ships like ants pulling a giant. And the world saw something strange. They floated. Each piece, as heavy as a battleship, stayed above the waves. Steady, stable. Engineers watched in silence. No cheering, no clapping, because this wasn't the success point. This was just a test. Then came the secret drills. Military trucks drove across the floating decks. Tanks were parked to test wing. Waves crashed against the sides. And still, they held. Someone whispered, "We just built an island that moves." Word spread among the workers. Not facts, just rumors. They're going to land these in Germany. No, in Africa. No, they're fake ports to fool Hitler. But the truth was bigger than all of them. These were real ports, real harbors, and they weren't made to fake an invasion. They were made to launch one. But the test didn't always go right. One day, a section broke loose in high winds. It drifted toward a public beach. Security teams had to pull it back before anyone saw it. On another day, a tank nearly flipped off the edge during weight testing. Engineers panicked. The military warned them, "Get it perfect, or don't do it at all." Because this wasn't just an experiment. The date had been chosen. The invasion of Europe was coming, and the pieces built in New Jersey had to work perfectly, or thousands would die. Inside locked rooms, blueprints were updated, designs improved, extra floating bridges were added. The final version would look like this: giant hollow blocks called Phoenix Cassoons, floating roads called whales, massive anchors to hold everything in place. Put it all together, and you had a port that could appear overnight on any beach in the world. The tests were passed, barely, but passed. And now came the most dangerous step: transportation. How do you move something that weighs more than a battleship across the sea without anyone noticing? The answer: very carefully, and mostly at night. In early 1944, the floating parts began to leave New Jersey. One by one, they were pulled by tugs through fog and darkness. No news reports, no photographs, only silence. Locals watched from a distance, seeing strange shapes floating down the river. But they didn't ask questions, because by then, everyone had learned it. Silence was part of the war. The floating giants moved quietly, slipping into the Atlantic like shadows, bound for a beach that didn't exist yet. A beach the world would soon call Normandy. The ships began to move, but no one was waving goodbye. There were no flags, no parades, no music, because this wasn't that kind of journey. This was war, and this was a secret. Dozens of steel monsters, each one the size of a building, were pulled slowly out of New Jersey shipyards. They moved like ghosts, painted gray, wrapped in fog, some towed at night, some hidden behind cargo convoys, each one headed for one destination, but no one dared say the name out loud. France. These weren't normal ships. They had no engines, no guns, no names. They were just floating steel blocks, but they carried something far more dangerous. Hope. If they reached the other side, the Allies could build a harbor on enemy soil. If they failed, the invasion of Europe might collapse. The mission was called Operation Mulberry, but even the sailors towing the parts didn't know the full plan. All they knew was, deliver the pieces. Do not lose them. Do not ask questions. And then, the ocean spoke. A storm rolled across the Atlantic. The waves rose high like fists. Wind screamed through the sky. The floating docks, some already fragile, started to twist. Some cracked. Others began to sink. Tugboats fought hard, but the sea was bigger, and it didn't care about plans or nations or wars. One officer wrote in his diary, "We lost one Phoenix. She broke her tow line, vanished in the storm, like a stone falling off the earth." Another piece flipped over. 3 men were nearly crushed, but somehow, most of the convoy held, pulled back together, retied, rescued from the waves. It took weeks, but piece by piece, the Ghost Fleet arrived in England, docked in secret coves, stored behind fences, watched by guards. There, they waited. Meanwhile, across the sea, the beaches of Normandy were being studied from the sky. Photos, maps, tide charts. The generals had picked the landing zone. Now, they needed a port, but no port existed, so they would build one, using the very pieces that had left New Jersey shores. Troops didn't know yet. Even commanders only had part of the picture. But somewhere, in a dark bunker, a full diagram was being drawn, and it looked like madness. A port made of floating blocks, dropped into the sea, built in days, under fire. It was risky. It was expensive. It was terrifying, but it was the only plan they had. Because once the D-Day invasion began, there would be no second try. One general told his men, "There are no ports in Normandy, so we're bringing ours with us." The Ghost Fleet was now ready. The men were ready. The war was waiting. And on the morning of June the 5th, 1944, the final order came down. Go. The sun had not risen yet, but the sea was already moving. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, were sailing straight into danger. just soldiers, not just tanks, but something floating, something massive, and not made for war, but made to bring war. As the first wave of Allied troops hit the beaches, the floating ports began their journey. Piece by piece, they were dragged through the chaos. The sky was full of smoke. The water turned red. Screams echoed through the wind. But still, the docks moved forward. At first, they looked like strange gray boxes. Dead weight, useless shapes. But the engineers knew what to do. They had trained for this, built this, tested this. And now, it was time to assemble it. Right there, on enemy land, they dropped the Phoenix Cassoons into the sea. Like giant Lego blocks, they sank just enough to stay steady. Each one became a wall, blocking the waves. Behind them, the floating roads were connected. Whales, long bridges made of steel, were stretched out from the sea to the sand. Then came the anchors, driven deep into the ocean floor. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, but by the end of the week, a full harbor had appeared, right on the coast of France. Ships that once had nowhere to dock now had a landing point. Tanks rolled off with speed, trucks full of ammo, fuel, food, hope followed behind. Men cheered, commanders cried, because the impossible had just been done. The Germans were shocked. They had expected a beach landing, not an entire city floating in the water. Their intelligence had failed. Their plans were broken, because the Allies didn't wait to capture a port. They brought their own. One soldier wrote in a letter, "We thought we'd have to fight for weeks to get a harbor, but they built one in days. I still don't understand how it's even real." The floating fortress from New Jersey now stood strong in enemy waters. More than 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies would pass through these ports in the coming months. All because of the work that started in silence. The Mulberry Harbor wasn't just an invention. It was a message that said, we don't wait, we build, we move, we take back what was lost. Even as bombs dropped nearby, even as storms tore across the beaches, the floating docks held. They shook, they cracked, but they held, because they weren't just made of steel. They were made of belief. And far away, in the shipyards of New Jersey, the workers who built those parts had no idea that what they made was now carrying the future of the free world. The battles moved inland. The beaches of Normandy were behind them now, but something stayed behind. Not a flag, not a monument, but a harbor, floating, standing, forgotten. For weeks, the Mulberry ports did their job, silently, without glory, without recognition. Ships came in day and night. Trucks rolled across floating bridges. Supplies stacked up like mountains. The war machine kept moving because the sea had been tamed. By steel, by welders, by hands no one would ever know. Back in New Jersey, the factories had returned to normal. The sparks stopped flying. The workers clocked out. Some were drafted. Some moved on. And some never even knew what they had helped build. There were no medals, no headlines, no thank you letters, because everything they built was still a secret. The government never told them. The military kept it quiet. And slowly, the world forgot. One of the harbors was destroyed by a storm weeks later. The other kept working, silently, faithfully, until the Allies no longer needed it. And then, it too was taken apart, piece by piece, swallowed by the sea. There were no tours, no news crews, no documentaries, only salt, rust, and time. Years passed, then decades. The people who designed it died with blueprints still locked in their drawers. The men who towed it across oceans buried their stories in silence. The workers who built it grew old, never knowing they helped change the world. One engineer, many years later, said in an interview, "It was the most important thing I ever helped with, and I never saw it in action." The soldiers got their medals, the generals wrote books, but the port, the floating megafortress, it faded, like smoke after battle. And yet, 2.5 million men used it. 500,000 vehicles crossed it. It fed an army that freed a continent. And it all started from welding sparks on a cold dock in New Jersey. History remembered the battles, the guns, the blood, but Not the steel that carried it all. Not the bridges that held under fire. Not the ports that floated in war. Not the invisible heroes who built victory with their bare hands. But the ocean remembers, and deep below, in the silence of the sea, pieces of the boat still rest, buried in sand, covered in rust, a hidden monument to a victory no one sees. Years passed, and then silence turned into dust. The war ended. The soldiers returned. The world moved on. But no one spoke of the floating port. No books. No photos. No memories. As if it had never existed. Until one day, a dusty file, in a locked military archive, was opened. Inside were drawings, old maps, blueprints with strange names. Phoenix, Whale, Mulberry Harbor. Documents marked top secret, and the truth began to rise, like the port once did, from below the surface. Historians were stunned. Engineers couldn't believe it. A full harbor, built in pieces, sailed across the Atlantic, dropped in the ocean, all during the most dangerous battle in modern history. It sounded like fiction, but it was real. New photos surfaced, grainy footage, testimonies from old men who had once stayed quiet. A factory worker in New Jersey saw the news and said, "I made those parts. I didn't know they went to France." The story spread. TV specials aired. Articles were written. College students studied what textbooks had skipped. A whole chapter of World War II, hidden for decades, now finally seen. But for many, it was too late. The builders were gone. The workers silent. The names lost to time. No statues. No medals. No parades. Just the truth. Arriving late. In the cold waters off the coast of Normandy, divers found broken remains, rusting steel, twisted bolts. What was once a living harbor was now an underwater grave. Not for men, but for memory. New Jersey never bragged about it, never claimed it. But now, people knew. They knew that victory didn't come from the front lines alone. It came from quiet hands, dainty overalls, and sparks flying off cold steel. Victory was built, and the floating mega-fortress, born in silence, tested in shadows, fought no battle, but held no war. So now, when you think of D-Day, think not just of beaches and billets, but of welders, of engineers, of New Jersey, and of a secret that floated, like a ghost, into history. This was the story of the harbor that vanished, and the heroes the world forgot.